Randy Meisner never wanted to be the face of anything. He was happiest by the drums, bass low on his hip, voice tucked neatly on top of other people's melodies. Yet in the middle of the 1970s, this self-described background person found himself at the heart of the loudest rock band in America. The Eagles, holding the emotional climax of their shows in his throat every night with "Take It to the Limit," while Glenn Frey and Don Henley battled managers, labels, and each other. Randy fought quieter wars. Ulcers, stage fright, a deepening dread of the moment when all spotlights would swing toward him and force him to become the hero of a song about reaching the end of what you can handle. When he finally chose to walk away from the band, when it got to the point of sanity or money, I thought I'd rather have sanity. The machine rolled on without him, rewriting the story so that his role could be filed under early member. What does it do to a gentle soul to be trapped inside a juggernaut built on perfectionism, ego, and endless touring? And when your greatest triumph on stage is also the thing that shatters your ability to keep going, is walking away an act of weakness, or the bravest, most expensive decision of your life? Before there were stadiums and lawyers and sound checks, there was the wind. On the Meisner family farm outside Scottsbluff, the wind had its own personality. It hissed through corn stalks in late summer, pushed snow across frozen fields in winter, rattled the thin windows of the farmhouse on nights when Randy lay awake in his small room, staring at the ceiling and imagining other lives. In summer, it carried the smell of damp soil and diesel. In winter, the metallic tang of cold that made your lungs sting when you breathed too fast. The house smelled of soil and coffee, of frying pans and old coats. His parents' conversations were about weather patterns, fertilizer, machinery, debts. They loved their son, but the world they knew had borders that ran along fence lines and property lines, not tour routes and chart positions. The idea that sound could carry you out of all this, that a vibrating string could open a door, was almost absurd. Then Elvis walked through their television. The family sat clustered in front of the screen, its picture slightly ghosted at the edges. Ed Sullivan did his introduction, and then there he was, Elvis Presley, all restless energy and contained sexuality, his presence pushing against the sensor's frame. Randy watched, utterly still, as the camera caught that combination of confidence and danger. The room around him, the wallpaper with its faded pattern, the ticking clock above the doorway, the smell of his father's cigarette, seemed to recede. He'd heard music before, of course, on the radio, in church, from his mother humming over dishes. But this was different. This wasn't background. This was an earthquake with hair grease. Something inside him shifted. He didn't want to be Elvis. There was nothing in his quiet Midwestern nature that longed for that kind of combustion. He just wanted to be closer to whatever that was. To be inside the sound instead of just listening to it bounce off the walls. The first guitar in the house wasn't fancy. The neck was a little warped, the frets sharp against his fingers. He learned his first chords from older boys, from radio songs, from trial and error. His fingertips blistered and peeled, then toughened into small calluses, silent badges no one at school really understood. After chores, after homework, he'd sit on the edge of his bed picking out progressions while the wind leaned against the house like an old friend who never knocked. In the school band room, the music teacher looked at the lineup and frowned. "We've got too many guitars," he said. "We need a bass." He held up the instrument like a challenge. Longer neck, thicker strings, fewer notes but more responsibility. It looked almost comically big in Randy's hands the first time he tried to play it. He plucked a string. The room vibrated in a way it never had when he'd been strumming chords up high. Posters on the wall shivered. A loose cymbal rattled on its stand. That low note settled in his chest. Without knowing it, he just accepted one of the defining roles of his life, the person at the foundation, the presence you feel more than see. A bass line doesn't usually get applause. It doesn't get quoted in magazine articles. But if it disappears, the whole thing falls apart. Nights in Scottsbluff started to follow a new rhythm. Days were still about school and chores, about mud on boots and the ache of lifting feed sacks. But as soon as he could, he escaped to any space with an outlet and a little privacy. A garage, a corner of the barn, a friend's basement. The notes he chased on his bass didn't match anything in his parents' world, but they made sense to him. He would play until his forearm burned, listening as the low frequencies wrapped around the small room like a second kind of weather. He formed a band, because that's what you do when you have an instrument and three friends with time and similar delusions. They were loud and a little sloppy. They played school dances, community events, VFW halls, any place willing to let a group of teenagers plug in. The first time a room full of kids actually danced to what they were playing, a jolt went through him. It wasn't arrogance, it was recognition. Sound could move people in ways words never had for him. He didn't have to give speeches or tell jokes. He just had to keep the root notes steady and slip his voice into the stack on the chorus. But the town had limits. The local scene had limits. Out beyond the fields, he could feel a pull he couldn't quite name. A tug towards cities where the names on record labels meant something. Where clubs stayed open past midnight. Where the sound he heard on Motown singles and California radio might be more than just signals bouncing off the clouds. He left. The road out of Nebraska was long. The landscape slowly changing from flat to textured, from quiet to loud. Gas stations replaced grain silos. Neon signs replaced windmills. In Denver and Los Angeles, he joined bands with names that flicker now on the edges of rock history. Drive-in Dynamics the Poor. They cut records that came and went, opened for bigger acts, scraped by. The gigs were a different kind of farm work. Load in, set up, sound check, play, tear down, sleep too little, repeat. Instead of tractors, there were vans. Instead of feed stores, there were grimy back doors of clubs. Instead of waiting for rain, you waited for the crowd to show up, and sometimes they didn't. Randy learned the small humiliations and joys of working musicianship. Club owners who shaved money off the agreed payment. Nights when 8 people showed up and 2 of them were staff. Mornings when your body ached, but the thought of not playing felt worse. He learned the taste of cheap diner coffee at 2 in the morning. The sound of his own laugh bouncing off motel room walls when someone told a joke that wasn't really funny but felt necessary. In hotel rooms and cheap apartments, he listened obsessively to records, Motown, Stax, the Beatles, the Byrds. His ear always drifted to the spaces under the melody, the movement of the bass and the interplay of the backing vocals. He wasn't dreaming of being the front man, he was studying how to be the invisible architecture. When Poco formed in the late 1960s, blending the twang of country with the drive of rock, it felt like someone had been listening to the same inner radio he'd been tuned to for years. Richie Furay, Jim Messina, Rusty Young, and Randy built something that, in another universe, might have been the biggest band of the era. Steel guitar wrapped around Telecasters, harmonies that sounded like open highways at dusk. Randy's bass carried the songs forward. His high harmonies rode on top like a hawk on thermal air. During the picking up the pieces sessions, he was fully in. He believed in the band, in the songs, in the idea that this might be the vehicle that finally took him all the way out of the farm and deep into the landscape he'd glimpsed on Ed Sullivan. In the studio, there was a sense of possibility. Headphones clamped on, the red light above the control room door blinking to life, the click of the tape machine like a starting gun. Then, in the way bands often do, things got complicated. Money, control, credit. The invisible currents that run beneath any creative partnership began to swirl. Decisions about mixes and sequencing were made in rooms he wasn't invited into. Randy wasn't a fighter. He didn't like confrontation. He didn't barge into offices or slam doors. He shut down, went quiet, carried resentment like a stone in his pocket. Choices were made. He was suddenly on the outside. The moment that hurt most wasn't the argument. It was the cover. He walked past a record store, saw picking up the pieces in the window and stopped. There was the band's name. There were the faces of the members he'd played with. His own face was missing. In his place, a dog, a smiling, oblivious dog sitting where he had stood in the original photo shoot. It was a joke to someone, maybe a throwaway design decision at a label. To Randy, it was confirmation of his worst suspicion, that a background person could be removed from the frame and replaced with anything, and the world would barely blink. Standing there on the sidewalk, traffic growling past, he was confronted with a brutal visual metaphor. If no one sees you, how hard is it for them to forget you were ever there? He moved on, because that's what musicians do. What else was he going to do? The bass wasn't a hobby anymore. It was part of him. But something in him had learned a lesson. Boards and contracts and photos could be edited. Memories and songs were all he could really own. He joined Rick Nelson's Stone Canyon band, backing a former teen idol reinventing himself as a serious artist. The music was lean, country-inflected, full of harmonies. Randy slotted in naturally. He didn't need the spotlight. He needed a good song, a solid groove, something to sing over. With Rick, he saw what it looked like to rebuild a career from the edges, to stop being a face on a poster and start being a musician again. That path led him to the woman whose backing band would accidentally become one of the biggest groups in rock history. Linda Ronstadt needed players who could handle anything. Country ballads, rockers, reinterpretations of old standards. Randy signed on, as did Glenn Frey, Don Henley, and Bernie Leadon. Night after night, they stood behind Linda, laying down tight arrangements while she tore through songs with that huge, expressive voice. In hotel bars afterwards, they'd talk about set lists and songs, about the music that had brought each of them to Los Angeles in the first place. In the half-light around her, something else was happening. When the four men sang together, their voices clicked into place in a way that was hard to ignore. Frey's and Henley's different textures, Leadon's country sweetness, Randy's piercing high parts. It sounded like a band inside a band. Linda saw it. So did they. Their blend felt less like a coincidence and more like a door quietly swinging open. They left her embrace with her blessing and stepped out on their own as Eagles. The early Eagles records are now so woven into the fabric of American radio that it's hard to hear how odd they were at the time. Country harmonies over rock drums, sad songs masquerading as easygoing sing-alongs, a kind of restless, beat-up romanticism that belonged as much to truck stops and motels as to Laurel Canyon. It was music for people who might dream of California but still had dirt under their nails. Randy's role was clear and crucial. He stood next to the drums, bass anchoring everything, and sent his high voice up like a flare above Frey's and Henley's leads. On Take It Easy, his harmony was the invisible glue on the choruses. On one of these nights, his falsetto gave the chorus its eerie, sensual shimmer. You didn't always know it was him, but you felt it. His singing was like a pressure point. You wouldn't notice it unless someone pressed on it, but it was holding a lot together. In interviews, he downplayed his importance. "A background person is all I've been all my life," he said. It wasn't false modesty. It was how he saw himself. Not as the guy out front, but as the one who made sure the guy out front sounded as good as he possibly could. In photos, he often looked slightly to the side, as if he'd wandered accidentally into the frame and was waiting, politely, to be allowed to step back out. And yet, one of the most important songs in the Eagles' catalog didn't just have his voice layered on top. It had his voice right in the middle. Take It to the Limit didn't spring fully formed from a committee. It began with Randy, with a feeling he couldn't shake, of being on the road too long, of nights blurring together, of creeping fear that life might pass you by while you were busy chasing whatever it was supposed to be. There was loneliness in it, and a kind of stubborn hope, the sense that even if you were already tired, you had to see how far you could push. The line, "Take it to the limit," was to keep trying, he explained later. Before you reach a point in your life where you feel you've done everything and seen everything, sort of feeling, part of getting old. He brought that fragment to Frey and Henley. Together they carved verses around it, scenes of late nights, empty rooms, a soul pushing against boundaries it didn't fully understand. They shaped a chorus that started conversational and grew into something almost operatic. The chords rose under him like stairs he had to climb every time he sang it. In the studio, Randy stepped up to the microphone, headphones pressing his hair down, the band behind the glass. He wasn't a belter in the traditional sense, but his range was astonishing. The song demanded that he climb and climb until the chorus turned into a cliff, the last one more time hanging on a high F sharp that pushed his voice right to its edge. He nailed it. On tape, you can hear the slight rasp at the top, the strain that gives the last phrase its power. It's not clean, it's human. That's why it hits so hard. The song became a hit, climbing to number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. Radio loved it. So did the crowd. DJs thread it between commercials and weather reports. Couples slow, danced to it in dark gyms and cheap rented halls. People drove through their own private midnights with Randy's voice pouring out of the dashboard. On stage, it became something more than a song. Eagles structured their shows so that Take It to the Limit sat near the end, the emotional peak before the final run of hits. The lights would dim, then slowly rise. Randy would step to center stage, bass suddenly feeling heavier without a mic stand or drum kit to hide behind. The rest of the band would fall back a little, physically and musically, leaving space for him to carry the moment. At first, the adrenaline masked everything else. He could ignore the butterflies, the nagging pain in his stomach, the way his mind sometimes went blank with panic. The roar of the crowd, the feel of the note locked in his throat, all of it created a high unlike anything he'd ever known in Nebraska. When he hit that last time, 20,000 people leapt to their feet as if yanked by a wire. But bodies have their own limits, and so do nerves. Touring in the mid-1970s wasn't a gentle process. It was long bus rides, overnight flights, inconsistent sleep, backstage spreads of food that weren't exactly designed for someone with ulcer problems. It was smoking too much, drinking too much, using whatever was around to stay awake or come down. It was always moving, always on. Randy began to feel his stomach burning more often. Doctors told him he had ulcers. He was exhausted, frequently sick, his anxiety coming in stronger waves. The very idea of that nightly F-sharp became, for him, not just a musical challenge, but a psychological one. What if he missed it? What if his voice cracked? What if he just couldn't? In the crowd, Take It to the Limit was an anthem about refusing to give up. For Randy, it started to feel like a dare he was losing the will to accept. The 1976-77 tour to support Hotel California was a marathon. 11 months of vast arenas, hotel rooms that all smelled vaguely the same, eardrum-crushing volume, and very little time to remember what it felt like to stand still. The bigger the venues got, the smaller his world felt. Stage, hotel, airport, bus, repeat. At the same time, his marriage was straining. He missed his family. The life that looked like a dream on posters was starting to feel like a trap from the inside. By the time they rolled into Knoxville, Tennessee in 1977, the tension inside him had become a knot. He had been battling the flu. His ulcer was flaring. He felt weak, frayed, and raw. Before the show, he told the others he didn't think he could handle Take It to the Limit that night as an encore. He was afraid of missing the note, afraid of collapsing, afraid of failing in front of tens of thousands and the men who depended on him. What happened next has been retold so many times that the myth almost eclipsed the reality. The simplified version goes like this. Randy refused to sing. Glenn Frey exploded. They had a huge fight. And that was the night Randy effectively got himself kicked out of Eagles because he was too scared to hit the note that had made him famous. The truth is more complicated, as it always is. Randy did sing during the show. He made it through his parts. The flashpoint came around the encore, around the expectation, maybe the demand, that Take It to the Limit would appear, that the crowd would get its catharsis, that the machine would function the way it was supposed to. Backstage, under fluorescent lights very different from the ones that would shine on Glenn Frey decades later in a hospital corridor. Anger flared. On stage, they had just finished a tight, professional show. The last chords still hung in the air. The crowd was cheering for more, stomping, clapping, unaware that behind the wall their heroes were tearing at each other. One story has Glenn hissing something along the lines of, "You're gonna go out there and do your job." His voice low and dangerous, the smile from the stage wiped clean. Another recalls Randy pushed past his own limit, snapping back, his own fear boiling over into defensiveness. There may have been shoves, raised voices, words you can't take back. Then the show. On stage, the faces of the band were calm, the music professional. Cameras captured none of the tension. They played the songs. The audience sang along, oblivious to the storm one thin wall away. If Take It to the Limit appeared or didn't, if it soared or stumbled, the moment backstage afterwards was the real point of no return. After Knoxville, something in Randy broke that couldn't be patched with another tour advance or another pep talk. He had been quietly approaching his limit for years. That night he stepped over it. Walking away from Eagles meant walking into a different kind of unknown. There was no guarantee that sanity was waiting for him on the other side of that decision. There was just the knowledge that staying meant certain damage. He chose the vague hope over the predictable harm. In the end, it was sanity or money, he would say later. "I thought I'd rather have sanity." In Nebraska, the sky looked the same as always. Rows of crops still lined the fields, but he was not the same kid who had left. He was a man in his early 30s with a famous song attached to his name, enough money to live but not enough to outrun his own brain, and a body that had begun to protest. Fame had given him a passport and a bank account. It hadn't given him any tools for dealing with the noise inside his own head. He spent time with his family. He tried to be present in ways tours had made impossible. He wrote songs that were smaller in scale but deeper in honesty. One More song, with its bittersweet nostalgia for sweaty nights in tiny clubs, felt almost like a letter to every version of himself that had stood under bad lighting playing his heart out for disinterested crowds. In bars and theaters, he sang those songs to hundreds instead of tens of thousands. Some nights people shouted for Eagles tunes. He obliged because how could he not? Those songs were his too, even if the courts and contracts told a more complicated story. When he reached for Take It to the Limit in those smaller rooms, the high note was still there sometimes. Worn, maybe, but intact. And the applause that followed felt less like a tidal wave and more like a tide licking at his feet. There were moments of grace. A fan would approach after a show, eyes wet, and say, "My dad loved Take It to the Limit. We played it at his funeral." Or, "That high note got me through some bad nights." Or, "Thank you for walking away when you did. It must have been hell." Randy would smile, shy as ever, and accept the thanks like a man accepting water in a desert he'd chosen to cross. He didn't see himself as a martyr. He saw himself as someone who had done what he had to do to stay even vaguely intact. But there were dark stretches as well. Periods when alcohol stopped being a social lubricant and became something more like a crutch with splintering wood. Friends noticed his mood swinging wider, his paranoia sharpening. There were calls for help, hospital stays, medications tried and discarded. Doctors' offices replaced dressing rooms. Intake forms replaced set lists. The man who once feared hitting a wrong pitch in front of 60,000 people now found himself fearing his own thoughts in rooms where no one was watching. By the time COPD announced itself fully, he had already lost other things. A sense of control, a stable marriage, pieces of his reputation carved away by gossip and half-understood reports. The lungs were just the latest part of his body to decide it had had enough. Breathing, which had once been an automatic engine behind his bass playing and his singing, turned into a conscious task. Sit down. Inhale carefully. Exhale slowly. Repeat. Simple things. Walking across a room, climbing into a car, took planning. The idea of stepping onto a stage and asking his chest to sustain anything at all felt increasingly distant, like remembering how it felt to run barefoot down a dirt road as a child, when now every step requires calculation. And yet his earlier self, the one on all those recordings, refused to be quiet. You could walk into a grocery store in December and hear his voice gliding above the speakers, the chorus of "Take It to the Limit" drifting between cereal aisles and freezer units. You could sit in a dentist's waiting room and hear his harmonies tucked behind Henley's lead on "The Best of My Love." You could scroll through streaming playlists and find his songs slotted into classic road trip mixes curated by people who hadn't yet been born when he left the band. In that strange way, the background person became inescapable without even being recognized. Then Lana died, and whatever fragile scaffolding of stability he'd managed to assemble collapsed again. The details of that night in Studio City are written in police reports and court documents, in grainy screenshots of home security footage that some outlets described but did not show. But the emotional truth is simpler and more brutal. A home that should have been a refuge became the place where everything fell apart. One moment, an argument and a rifle being moved from one place to another. The next, a shot, a body on the floor, a life severed. For a man who had never liked being the center of attention, seeing his name linked with words like shooting and investigation must have felt like a nightmare you can't wake up from. Whatever his faults, and he had them, he was not built for the glare of sensation. He was built to stand by the drums, eyes closed, hitting high notes no one could believe. Now his image, such as it was dragged into a different kind of spotlight, one he had no control over and no way to exit. After that, he receded from public view almost completely. Lawyers and doctors and judges appeared where producers and managers once had. The word conservatorship surfaced in headlines, tying his name to legal debates about control and capacity. On paper, it was about protecting him from harm, from himself, from others, from the chaos of his circumstances. In reality, it was another reminder that his life had never fully belonged to him, that systems larger than he was had always had a say. When the news of his death came in 2023, it did not dominate the cycle the way the deaths of some of his contemporaries had. Glenn Frey's passing had prompted long specials, major features, hours of radio tribute. For Randy, there were respectful obituaries, social media posts from musicians and fans, a statement from Eagles themselves calling him an integral part of the band's early success, and then life unbothered rolled on, except in the lives of the people whose personal histories had grafted themselves onto his voice. There was the woman who, as a teenager, sat on the floor of her parents' living room and cried through "Take It to the Limit" after her first heartbreak. Now listening again as a grandmother and feeling the same ache in a different body. The man who put on "Try and Love Again" the night his marriage collapsed, then years later when he dared to date someone new. The son who played "Take It to the Limit" on his phone at the bedside of his dying father because that song had always made his dad close his eyes and hum along. Randy Meisner never knew most of their names. They barely knew his. They knew that high voice, that sense of a man stretching himself to the edge of what he could handle. "A background person is all I've been all my life," he once said. There is humility in that, and also a quiet kind of pride. Not everyone is built to be the face. Not everyone should be. Music and life falls apart without people willing to stand just to the side, holding everything up. But even background people have limits. When it got to sanity or money, he chose sanity, and discovered that in a world built around profit and performance, sanity is not a switch you flip once. It is a battle you fight over and over, often losing ground even when you make the bravest possible choices. Walking away from the machine didn't guarantee him peace. It simply removed one particular kind of noise so he could hear the others more clearly. Randy Meisner's life suggests that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is not to hit the note again, not to take on one more time, but to say no, to refuse, to step away from the roar even when your name is still on the marquee, your percentage still sitting in someone's spreadsheet. To accept that some songs are not meant to be sung every night for the rest of your life, no matter how much the crowd demands it. Of course, stepping away doesn't erase the cost. It didn't save him from illness. It didn't shield him from tragedy. It didn't guarantee him a peaceful old age. The universe is not a tidy accountant, so his story leaves us with a harder, more uncomfortable question. In a culture that worships pushing harder, going further, staying longer, what do we lose when we romanticize the person who always hits the high note and ignore the cost of getting there? When we cheer for one more time, do we ever wonder who we're asking to bleed for that encore? In your own life, what are you taking to the limit? Your health, your patience, your relationships, your sense of self. Are you pushing for that last impressive note because it truly matters, or because someone else built a show that depends on you, pretending you have no limits at all? And if one night, like Randy Meisner in Knoxville, you realize you're standing at a line you cannot cross and still recognize yourself on the other side, will you keep walking out for one more time? Or will you have the courage to step back into the shadows, trusting that sometimes the quietest exit is the only way to stay whole?